Very good afternoon, dear participants. The fourth lecture of mine in the series of nuclear reactions and production of isotopes. I had kept it for nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. If you recollect, Dr. Reddy had mentioned about that I will be covering this part of nuclear fission. And also there have been questions during Professor Umar Shankari's lecture on nuclear fusion reactor technology. So, though I am not an expert in fusion reactor technology, I thought at least the basics of that technology I can share with you whatever I know. So the plan of my today's lecture will be, I'll give you the basic fundamentals of nuclear fission. The nuclear fission process, its mechanism has not been discussed in detail, though the exploitation of fission into producing electricity has been described comprehensively by Professor Uma Shankari Kannan in her 6 lectures. So I will touch basically on the fundamental aspects of the mechanism of nuclear fission, then the energetics of this process, and 2 important observations of nuclear fission, that is the mass distribution and kinetic energy distribution, kinetic energy of fission fragments. These 2 properties, in fact, gave a lot of insight into the mechanism of nuclear fission, and that I will try to explain based on these 2 observations what new mechanisms people proposed that I will discuss, and then briefly touching upon how the nuclear fission process limits the extension of periodic table. If you want to synthesize heavier elements, how nuclear fission will hamper that process, and briefly how the periodic table extension experiments have been taking place. I will just explain. Then I will come to the nuclear fusion. What are the mechanisms by which nuclear fusion technology is being proposed, and what are the challenges in that? I will touch upon that aspect. Okay, so this must be familiar to you. The binding energy curve. This plot shows the binding energy per nucleon. This is y-axis is binding energy per MeV, and x-axis is the mass number of the isotopes. This is a very familiar curve to you, and you see here it is expanded scale from 7.3 to 8.9 MeV per nucleon. So the binding energy per nucleon rises, reaches a maximum around mass number 60, and then falls down monotonously up to, let us say, at mass number 250, it becomes 7.5 or so, 7.6 or so. So if you put it in the scale of 0 to 10, it will be a flat line. And that is how we explain the gross property of the nuclei in terms of the constant binding energy per nucleon, which explained that the nuclear forces are short-range and attractive. But when you expand this scale of binding energy per nucleon, we will find that the binding energy per nucleon initially rises, and later on, after mass number 50 or 60, it goes down. Now, the 2 processes of nuclear fusion and fission can be explained in terms of the energetics of these 2 processes can be explained in terms of this plot. When we discuss about nuclear fusion, we are trying to fuse the 2 light nuclei like deuterium and tritium into a little bit heavier nucleus, helium-4 plus a neutron. So essentially we are going up in the early part of this binding energy curve that is shown by this arrow. So what we are seeing here is we are forming a relatively heavy nucleus having higher binding energy per nucleon from 2 lighter nuclei having relatively lower binding energy per nucleon. So whenever we have a reaction, a nuclear reaction, when the binding energy per nucleon increases from reactants to products, that reaction is exergic. And therefore, energetically, nuclear fusion of light nuclei to give heavier nuclei up in this range is energetically favorable. Similarly, in nuclear fission, we have the heavy nuclei around mass number 240 and splitting into two fragments of lower mass in the mass region around 100, 140, 100 to 100 to 140, let us say. So we are going from heavy nucleus of relatively lower binding energy per nucleon, about 7.6 MeV per nucleon, to medium mass nuclei having binding energy 8.5 MeV per nucleon. So again, we go from nuclei having lower binding energy per nucleon to products having relatively higher binding energy per nucleon. And therefore, this fission also energetically favorable. Here I have given an example of a binary fission where 235 uranium plus neutron gives to 102 molybdenum plus 132 tin plus neutrons. And you can see here that small change in binding energy per nucleon, 8.5 minus 7.6 into 235 nucleons, close to 200 MeV energy. So the energetics of even the processes can be explained from the binding energy graph. So I hope it makes it clear how binding energy curve can help in explaining the energetics of nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. Now let's compare the two processes of nuclear fission and fusion in terms of different properties like energy released and the waste products formed and so on and so forth. So just now I discussed that in the nuclear fission, 200 million electron volts is released for 236 nucleons. Around 0.8 MeV per nucleon energy is released. In the case of nuclear fusion, if you recall the previous slide, 17.6 MeV energy is released when deuterium and tritium fuse together. So you can see 17.6 by 5 nucleons. So about 3.5 MeV energy is released per nucleon. So you can see here the energy released per nucleon is much higher for nuclear fusion than that in the nuclear fission process. That is the plus point for nuclear fusion. But in the case of nuclear fission, you can see you can induce even by low energy neutrons. So very easy process. But in the case of nuclear fusion, we require to fuse the charged particles. And because of the charged particles, they have a Coulomb barrier for fusion. That Coulomb barrier is of the order of more than 10 kilo electron volts. And if you convert this into temperature, it becomes 100 millions or so. So that is the challenge. Nuclear fission process gives long-lived fission products. So they are a problem. Radioactive waste generation is a problem in nuclear fission. Whereas in the case of fusion, you don't get much radioactive products, but you get huge amount of tritium and neutrons. So which are not that a big a problem in terms of waste management. The power from fission reactors is being realized for the last 50, 60 years or even more. So we are harnessing energy from nuclear fission process in terms of electricity, but the fusion energy from the fusion to produce electricity is yet to be realized. So this is a challenge for the scientists. Okay. So let us discuss the nuclear fission process a little more in details. As I discussed in my initial lectures that the nuclear fission process was discovered in December 1938 by Otto Hahn and Strassmann. And later on, Niels Bohr in 1939 explained the energetics of nuclear fission in terms of the liquid rock model. So in the case of a liquid drop model, the ground state is spherical. So Niels Bohr explained in terms of the binding energy of a liquid drop model. If you recollect the lectures by Dr. A.V.R. Reddy, the binding energy has contributions from volume energy, which is the major part, and then there are corrections to the Coulombic energy and surface energy. So when a nucleus has to undergo fission, it has to undergo deformation. So I am explaining the energetics of a deforming nucleus. So y-axis is the potential energy of a deforming nucleus, and x-axis is the deformation parameter alpha 2, which gives you the symmetric deformation around the semi-major axis. So this gives you spheroids. It's called alpha 2 deformation. So when you deform the spherical nucleus, the surface energy of the nucleus is increasing. That means there are now more nucleons on the surface, and surface energy term is increasing. Whereas the protons are now in a deformed nucleus, protons are little apart from each other compared to spherical nucleus, and therefore the Coulombic energy is decreasing. So Coulomb energy is trying to stabilize the nucleus, whereas the surface energy term is destabilizing the nucleus. And it is the net result of this Coulomb energy and surface energy that explains whether a nucleus will undergo fission or not. So I have tried to explain the energetics of a nuclear fission process in terms of the surface energy and a Coulomb energy of deforming nucleus. The surface energy is given in terms of surface energy of the sphere into 1 plus 2 by 5 alpha 2 square minus alpha 4 term. So this is the alpha 2 second order deformation or spheroidal deformation or quadrupolar deformation. And the Coulomb energy is decreasing, so it is EC equal to EC0, 1 minus 1 by 5 alpha 2 square and so on. Now, so initially the nucleus is spherical, it is stable in its ground state, but if by some means, like by injecting a neutron, or even in spontaneous fission, it has a probability to penetrate this barrier. That barrier is arising because of the resultant of the surface and Coulomb energy term. So when the Coulomb energy term becomes more than the surface energy term, then the nucleus becomes unstable towards fission. And therefore, we define a term called fissility parameter in terms of a chi in terms of delta EC upon delta ES, which you can put in terms of this spherical energy and alpha 2 parameters, and it becomes EC0 upon 2 ES0, and the Coulomb energy of a sphere is AC z square by a raised to 1/3, and the surface energy of a sphere is 2 AS a raised to 2/3. So if you take the ratio of these two, and you can take the value of AC and AS0, then the fissility parameter becomes z square by 50.13 into mass number. This mass number in the denominator. So you can see it has got a relationship with z square by a. So depending upon the value of z square by a, you will have barriers vary. So if your nucleus has got very low z square by a, it will have a very high fission barrier. If the nucleus has very high z square by a, it will have very small fission barrier. So like for example, for 238 uranium, this z square by a upon 50.13 is 0.71, and so it has got a finite barrier. The spontaneous fission half-life for 238 uranium is very, very high, 10 to 15 years or so. But for californium 252, this value of chi becomes 0.76. So from 0.71 to 0.76, and it becomes for californium 252, this half-life for spontaneous fission becomes 85 years. So you can see here, this fission half-life has got very strong dependence on the barrier height. So the spontaneous fission of the heavy nuclei can be explained in terms of the penetration through this small fission barrier, whereas the induced fission of heavy nuclei can be explained by the energy brought in by the neutron or other charged particles which will be sufficient to cross the Coulomb barrier. This fission barrier for 235 uranium is of the order of 5-6 MeV, and a neutron will bring in about that 6 MeV energy by binding energy. That is why these actinides can undergo fission with thermal neutrons, like 235 uranium, 239 plutonium. Okay, they can undergo fission with thermal neutrons. That means whatever energy thermal neutron brings in terms of binding energy is sufficient to induce fission in these nuclei. Now, once the nucleus is committed to fission, this saddle point, this is the saddle point, which is again a spheroidal nucleus, but deformed, highly deformed, which is now descending down this path and ultimately reaches a point called fission point, where the two fragments are formed and there is a neck between the two fragments and it is about to split. So there is a Coulombic torque between those two fragments and they fly in opposite direction with a high amount of angular momentum. So the schematic of the fission and post-fission phenomena I have tried to explain using this slide. So the nucleus, when it captures a neutron, it forms a nucleus, compound nucleus which is excited. One of the options for this nucleus is to undergo gamma decay, like 238 uranium plus a neutron, 239 uranium undergoing gamma decay, beta minus decay to become 239 neptunium. Or if the excitation energy is more than the fission barrier, then it becomes committed towards fission, it undergoes deformation. Then it's at scission point, it splits into two fragments, Z1, Z2, A1, A2, and in the time scale of -21 to -20 seconds, this fission, it splits into two. And now these two fragments, which are very highly energetic, their energies are 100 MeV or so, these accelerated fragments then emit neutrons because they have very high excitation to form fission products. And then these fission fragments emit neutrons to form fission products. These fission products will emit gamma ray and beta minus to ultimately become stable end products. So this is the chain of events that happens once a nucleus is committed to fission. So what are the energetics involved in emission of different types of products that are formed in nuclear fission? The fission fragments which are emitted in the nuclear fission take away the major part of the reaction. Energy, about 200 MeV the energy, let us say, then 168, let us say about 85% of the energy of the Q values taken by the fragments in the form of their kinetic energy. Because when the two fragments separate, the Z1, Z2 E squared by R1 plus R2, that is going at the kinetic energy of the fragments. When the fragments emit neutrons, around 5 MeV for neutrons energy, then they emit gamma ray, about 7 MeV, prompt gamma rays. Then there are a lot of fission products formed which are emitting beta particles, so about 8 MeV at beta energy. Then also the neutrinos are emitted in terms of about 12 MeV. And finally, the fission products emit beta and gamma, that gamma energy of the rock, 7 MeV. So you can see the breakup of the energetics of the Q value for 200 MeV in this fashion. So in the reactor, all of them except probably the neutrinos, they will deposit energy. Neutrinos will escape the reactor boundary and they may not deposit energy. Okay, now let us discuss, as I mentioned, the mass distribution and the kinetic distribution. The mass distribution in thermal neutron-induced fission of 235, I have shown a graph here, a plot of yield of the fission fragments or fission products versus the mass number. The mass number goes from 70 to 170, so essentially 80 to 160. And the yield from 0.001% to 10%, so about 7.5% or so. Now, this is what we call as the double hump fission mass distribution. That means the mass, the yield for the symmetric splitting of the nucleus into two equal halves is much less than that for the asymmetric splitting. If 236 uranium splits into two equal half, then 117 is here. which is at the valley. So 117 mass, the yield is very low, about 0.01%. Whereas 138 and here 95 is order of 7.5%. So it is a predominantly mass asymmetric mass distribution called double hump. There are two humps. So this is the heavy mass and the lighter mass. And the total cross section for the fission of 235 uranium with neutron is 583 bond, and this mass yield curve has an area 200%, because 100 fission give you 200 fission products. So the area under this graph is 200 for 100 fission, and this 583 bond is distributed among the different fission products, you can say. So you can say 200 to 583 by 200 into this yield is the cross section for the formation of each fission product that one can calculate. Okay, so the peak to valley, that peak is here 95 and 138, and valley is here symmetry 0.01. That ratio is 620. Now, as I mentioned, that for each, this is the graph, x-axis is mass number. For each mass number, there are several isobars. I have given two examples for the heavier and the lighter mass fission products. Let us say for 138 mass number, you will have the stable isobar is 56 barium. The barium 138 is stable, but the products that are formed start from iodine 153, iodine 138, 53 atomic number, 6.23 second, 138 xenon, 14.08 minutes, 138 cesium, 55, 33.4 minutes. So this is actually like a parabola. If you recall the lectures by Dr. Reddy of mass parabola, then this all mass numbers, same mass number or different atomic number, they will fall in a parabola, and there will be successive beta minus decay until it reaches the stability. And you can see the farther the fission product is away from stability, shorter the half-life. Similarly, for the lighter mass fragment, mass product 95 mass chain, let us say, we have strontium 95, 23.9 seconds, yttrium 95, 10.3 minutes, zirconium 95, 65 days, niobium 95, 35 days, and 95 molybdenum stable. So you can see there is a series of beta minus decay before they come to stable isotope, isobar, molybdenum 95. And like this, for every mass chain, you will have this kind of isobaric chains. Now you can see, so if there are from, let us say, 80 to 150, 70 mass chains, for each mass chain, let us say 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 to 5. So 70 into 5, about 350 to 400. So there are about 400 fission products formed in the fission. And their yields are in this way. Another important observation in nuclear fission is the kinetic energy distribution. I am just giving you an example here that if the nucleus splits into two equal halves, when the lighter mass and heavier mass are same, then for this the kinetic energy is supposed to be maximum, because when Z1 equal to Z2, then Z1 Z2 E square by R1 plus R2 will be maximum. So the total kinetic energy should be maximum for the symmetric fission of the heavy nucleus. But what is observed is here that the total kinetic energy for a symmetric split is, let us say, 168 MeV, but for the asymmetric splitting is more. So as a function of mass of the heavy fragment, the total kinetic energy is increasing, becomes maximum for 132 mass number, and then decreases. So instead of decreasing continuously from symmetric splitting, the kinetic energy is increasing. That means for asymmetric splitting of the heavy nucleus, kinetic energy is more. I have tried to give this explanation, this fission fragment spectrum here. So the heavy mass fragment is 100, and lighter mass fragment is 100 MeV, and heavy mass fragment is about 68 MeV. The sum total of these two will be 168 MeV. But there are fragments having energy 110 MeV also, and here 80 MeV. So 110 plus 80, 190. So you will see that they correspond to the heavier asymmetric mass split. So how to explain this asymmetric mass split? I try to give example here, that if one of the fragments happens to be spherical and other is deformed as usual, then the distance between the centers of the two fragments will become smaller than when both are asymmetric. And so the heavier mass fragment can take spherical shape for 132 mass region. 132 corresponds to 50 proton and 82 neutron shell, like tin 132, which is spherical in its ground state. So this gives us a proof that the fragment's cell structure also plays a role in governing the kinetic energy distribution of fission fragments. So this gave a clue that why the mass distribution is asymmetric. That means this particular splitting has more energy released, and therefore this probability is high compared to this. So there are two aspects. One is the kinetic energy, the other one is the yield. The yield was explained by the mass distribution graph and the kinetic energy distribution by this graph. So let us try to explain in terms what is the mechanism of this asymmetric splitting being more probable than symmetric splitting. Okay, so I just try to give little bit explanation without going too much into detail, but this is an important observation, because how to explain this asymmetric mass distribution? You must have seen in several lectures that mass distribution of 235 uranium and thermal fission is asymmetric. So I try to give explanation here using this slide. So in the liquid drop model, we discussed that the nucleus is spherical in its ground state, and then the liquid drop model predicts a graph like this, single fission barrier based on the liquid drop. But actually, in actual practice, the uranium and this actinide nuclei around mass 230 to 40 are actually deformed in their ground state. They are not spherical in their ground state. So nucleus is deformed. This is the x-axis is deformation. So when the nucleus is deformed and you further deform it, then to the liquid drop model, you have to add the shell correction. And when you add the shell correction to the liquid drop model, you get a double hump mass distribution. So there are two maxima, like saddle points. In the liquid drop model, we show one saddle point here, but for these, when you correct for the shell corrections for a deforming nuclei, there are two maxima, and this is called the double hump fission barrier. Nothing to do with the double hump mass distribution. The fission barrier itself is double hump. But this fission barrier is double hump does not explain double hump mass distribution, because this x-axis is symmetric deformation of the nucleus. But this double hump fission barrier explains the rotational states of nucleus in its ground state, in the second minimum, the fission isomers, and so on. But if you want to explain the asymmetric mass distribution, then we should discuss this particular landscape in one more dimension called mass asymmetric coordinate. So here I have explained this graph in the third axis, the perpendicular to the plane of the PC. This is alpha 3. If x-axis here is alpha 2, perpendicular to this axis is alpha 3. And then when we go along alpha 3, you find that alpha 2 equal to 0 is maximum. Around the alpha 2, there is maximum, and alpha 3, when it is non-zero, there are minima. So see, this symmetric shape has got higher energy here compared to the asymmetric shape, which are having lower energy. The same thing I tried to explain using a landscape, a mountain. When you want to cross this mountain from perpendicular direction, then we don't go through this mountain, but we go through this valley. So it is like, if this corresponds to the symmetric shape, then this is a high energy path. Instead of that, prefer to go to a low energy path, which happens to be the asymmetric shape. And this is the saddle point model of the nucleus, whereby the asymmetric shape of the nucleus, the deformation in the asymmetric degree of freedom having low energy. And one of the explanation for asymmetric mass distribution is given by this. There are other models where when that nucleus is already, the two fragments are formed, the fragment structure also plays a role. That is another model, but we will not go into details of that. So essentially, in the case of saddle point model of the nucleus, you can explain the asymmetric splitting of the nucleus. Okay, just to explain how fission affects the stability of heavy nuclei, and in fact, one of the challenges in extending the periodic table is the limitation due to fission. I will spend a few minutes on to this particular aspect. That is, let us say, based on the liquid drop model, I try to explain the fission barrier, let us say, fission parameter 0.6, high fission barrier. If you go to heavier nuclei like fermium isotopes, fission parameter 0.8, fission barrier is very low. But when x equal to 1.0, then there is no barrier. Fission barrier is 0. So this is derived based on the liquid drop model, wherein we have the surface energy and the Coulomb energy term. But when you produce this heavy nuclei in a reaction of heavy projectiles, then heavy ion projectiles bring a large angular momentum. And because of the large angular momentum, the fission barrier further goes down. And so this, you can see here that for a nucleus like 153 europium, the fission barrier decreases once you have higher and higher angular momentum. So if you bring in higher angular momentum, fission barrier goes down, and a situation comes when fission barrier becomes 0. So I try to explain here, this is a very important graph of mass number versus angular momentum. And this is the graph when fission barrier value becomes 0. What is the value of minimum angular momentum for which the fission barrier becomes 0? So for a mass number 100, nucleus of mass number 100, for 65 H cross angular momentum, fission barrier to 0. That means you cannot populate a nucleus of mass number 100 with angular momentum more than 65. For a mass number, nucleus 200 mass number, the fission barrier becomes 0 for angular momentum, let us say 90. And for mass number 300, the angular momentum, the fission barrier becomes 0 for mass number 20. So if you try to produce a heavy nucleus using heavy ion nuclear reactions beyond certain value of angular momentum, that nucleus cannot survive fission. And this is what I try to explain by this slide, that fission barrier becomes 0 for certain angular momentum because of the disruptive nature of the centrifugal force. And therefore, this puts a limitation on how much you can extend the periodic table. And therefore, the fission barrier height decreases, increasing atomic number, that is in terms of the Z square by A. But with increasing angular momentum, also fission barrier increases. So decreases, this I have using this explanation. And the fission competition with particle evaporation limits the formation of heavy nuclei. So fission dominates heavy nuclei, and therefore the evaporation residue cross sections are very, very low. Another limitation to formation of the heavy nuclei is hindrance to fusion. Just to give a brief explanation, that when we have two heavy nuclei like argon plus gold, when they are going to fuse together, then we are coming from the infinity, and the nuclear potential, this is the Coulomb potential. So the sum total of this will give you a pocket in the one-dimensional potential energy barrier. And so these two nuclei can fuse together, giving rise to a nucleus of 79 plus 18, 97 or so. Now, if you want to produce super heavy elements like mass number, atomic number 120 or so, like 79 plus 54, 135 or so, 133, 233, then for these nuclei, that potential energy barrier pocket vanishes. And so it is not possible to trap these two projectile targets into a form of a compound nucleus. So this I tried to explain. This hindrance to fusion, in fact, have been the subject of much discussion among the nuclear physics community who tried to form super heavy nuclei by fusion of two nuclei. So the Coulombic term and the nuclear energy, nuclear potential and Coulomb potential. These two, the Coulomb potential is attractive, repulsive, and Coulomb potential is attractive. And so I would just explain there is a pocket for these two, some of the two, but for heavy projectile target combination, the pocket vanishes. So there is a critical value of this so-called effective facility parameter, Z square by A effective, given by this formula, 4Z1 Z2 by A1 1/3, A2 1/3 it should be. So essentially it is the two radii of the nuclei and their charges. So if it is less than or equal to 48, then they can form a pocket, they can fuse together. If it is more than 48, probably they are unable to fuse. And so that previous slide, argon plus gold was, this value was 31, so they could fuse together. And for xenon plus gold, this is 52, so they are unable to fuse together. And one of the reasons for that is this one, that for argon plus gold, Z square by A effective is less than the threshold value of 48. So what happens? That when the two projectile target combination come together, this is the touching configuration, then what I am showing here is the potential energy where there is a conditional saddle. That means this conditional saddle is out. That means at this point, the different degrees of freedom like mass, energy, charge start equilibrated. And so the nucleus can come, the composite system can come inside this conditional saddle, they can fuse together, and then this will evolve to fission. Or it can be trapped as an evaporation residue. But for heavier projectile target combination like xenon plus gold, this touching configuration is outside this conditional saddle. That means they cannot come close enough to be inside this pocket. And so before this, they come to this conditional saddle. Before that, they separate out. And this is what is called as the quasi-fission. They separate out as two projectile target combinations, but some degrees of freedom equilibrate, but the mass degree of freedom does not equilibrate, and therefore this is a limitation. It's called a quasi-fission. You need to push them together more to come inside this to form a single mononucleus. So these are some of the subjects, which are challenging to the nuclear physics community, those who are studying nuclear reactions to form heavy nuclei. So because of these two limitations, the attempts to synthesize super heavy elements have been there going on for the last many years. So right now, atomic number 118 have been synthesized, and you can see here there are two approaches to synthesize super heavy elements. One is called the hot fusion. You take uranium, thorium plus heavy nuclear projectiles. So you can say uranium plus like 92 plus 20, calcium 112, 102, 112, so 20 calcium. Here you reach here. But if you can also, that's called hot fusion, means the compound nucleus has got very high excitation energy. Whereas there is something called cold fusion. If you use lead bismuth as target nuclei and bombard with the heavy nuclei, so like 82 plus, let us say, to go to 120, you have 40. So about zirconium. So you bombard with very high projectiles. Then because of this doubly magic configuration of these targets, the excitation energy of the compound nucleus is very small, and that's why it's called cold fusion, not in terms of the cold fusion of deuterium tritium, but relatively colder compared to the hot fusion that brings in low excitation energy, so the particle evaporation becomes low and the nucleus can survive fission. So these are the two approaches, hot fusion and cold fusion, to synthesize super heavy elements in the range of 114, 184 Z and N, right up to 118 atomic number are already synthesized. And this, as I discussed, the limitations in reaching here are fission and hindrance to fusion. These are the two processes, challenges which people are trying to meet. So that was about the nuclear fission and its extension of periodic table with regard to limitation to fission. Now, in the few slides, I try to explain the nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is like two charged nuclei undergoing fission. So, in terms of the mechanism, there is nothing. Just two charged particles are coming together and forming a compound nucleus. So, fusion of two light nuclei to form a heavier nucleus, releasing large amount of energy, like deuterium plus deuterium, forming helium-4, which is excited enough to emit helium-3 plus neutron. And in this process, 3.2 MeV energy is released. So these are now charged particles. So you require certain energy because they will have a Coulomb barrier. So to cross the Coulomb barrier, they have to have certain kinetic energy. And so that we will discuss later on about what are the energy required to fuse different projectile targets. But they are called thermonuclear reactions because they require high temperature. The deuterium fusion giving helium-3 plus neutron releases energy of 3.2 MeV. Deuterium-tritium fusion releasing 17.6 MeV, giving rise to helium plus neutron. And lithium-6 and proton fusing together to giving helium-4 and helium-3, giving 4 MeV energy. So there are different thermonuclear reactions one can try to fuse. I try to explain them in the next graph. The excitation function. What is excitation function? Cross-section versus energy of the projectile. So I have tried to explain the excitation function, means the cross-section in terms of the millibarn here, 0.1 to 10,000 millibarn, as a function of energy of the projectile here. Like here, deuterium is the projectile. Deuterium is bombarding tritium or deuterium or helium-3. So for different reactions like A, B, C, D, this is A, B, C, D. These are the excitation function. So you can see here, A has got the lowest threshold. If you recall the reaction, pi r square 1 minus Vc by ECM. So this is the graph like pi r square is 1 minus Vc by ECM. So Vc is like close to Vc here. So beyond this energy, cross sections are very low, close to 0. So about 10 keV is the energy in keV, is the threshold for the first reaction. And that is the lowest threshold. For B, deuterium, helium, tritium plus proton, threshold is around 15 MeV. For C, around 17, and for D, around 35. So if you want to achieve fusion in the laboratory, D plus T will be the one which will be having lowest threshold. And therefore, to bring the two charged particles together, we need to cross the Coulomb barrier. And to cross the Coulomb barrier, they have to have high energy, and that means they have a high temperature. So typically, you know that 10 keV will correspond to 100⁸ Kelvin. And so if you want to have a container to hold the reactants, it's a challenge to have a container which would withstand this kind of temperatures. So in this process, there have been two approaches: magnetic confinement and inertial confinement. Essentially, when you have the deuterium gas at this temperature, so it is a plasma. So that you have to confine. You cannot have a container which will withstand this high temperature. So you have to confine the plasma, and for that there are, or the fuel at high temperature. There are two approaches: inertial confinement and the magnetic confinement. So in the inertial confinement, what is essentially done is we take a solidified fuel of deuterium tritium, like a coconut shell, very hard. So you can have a solidified fuel where you bombard this solid fuel with high power laser beams of CO2 or NdArg beams. So when you bombard this solidified fuel, this will ablate the molecules from the surface, and this ablating molecules will give kick to the inner atoms or molecules, and there will be compression of the pellet, solidified fuel, so the density will increase. So evaporating atoms from this solid fuel surface bring together interior atoms, and because of that compression, the density will rise to by a factor of more than 1000. And as a result of that, the temperature can go to 10.8 Kelvin or so in a very short time of the order of nanoseconds. And in that short time, then the fusion can take place. So essentially, why it is called inertial confinement? Because the reacting particles are held together by virtue of their mass. So when you are ablating, they are giving the kick, and so by mass they are confined together as a solid fuel, and that's why it is called the inertial confinement. Whereas the most successful methodology to confine the plasma has been the magnetic confinement, wherein the deuterium-tritium fuel is held in a donut-shaped chamber, where you use electric field to increase the kinetic energy of the charged particles. So simple E into E, charge into the potential, and the magnetic field is kept to keep the charged particles move in a circular motion, keep away from the surface. So in fact, this is called the toroidal shaped magnet, the tokamak, toroidal chamber for magnetic confinement. Tokamak essentially means toroidal chamber for magnetic confinement. So that tokamak is the machine used to confine the plasma in a toroidal magnetic field so that it does not touch the surface of the container. And so to achieve that, is what I call as the critical value of there are in fact two parameters called the plasma density and the confinement time. Rho is the plasma density and tau is the confinement time, and there is a criterion called the Lawson's criterion. So if you want to achieve a higher output, energy output, because to fuse the two nuclei to generate the plasma, you require very high throughput of energy. So when you have a large amount of input of energy, then unless you have a higher energy output, there is no point of that system. So the condition to have a higher energy output compared to the input energy is called given by the Lawson. So Lawson's criteria is that the product of plasma density into the confinement time has to be more than or equal to 10 to the power 14 seconds per cc for the deuterium-tritium fuel. If you have deuterium fuel, then this criterion is 10 to the power 16. It is more stringent. So that means what? You can have 10 to the power 14 plasma per second per centimeter cube for 1 second, or 10 to the power 10 particles per cc for 10 to the power 4 seconds. So that means you have to compromise between these two. So one can achieve for nanosecond 10 to the power 23 particles per cc. But the idea is to sustain it for much longer time. So there have been people have achieved this Lawson's criterion for a microsecond or nanosecond, but there is no point of that. So idea is to sustain it for thousands of seconds, and therefore all the attempts are being made to achieve this sort of criticality, like we had criticality in the fission, where you could sustain the chain reaction. In the case of plasma fusion, the criterion of Lawson, if it can be met, then you can have a higher energy output compared to input. So once you acquire the high temperature required to fuse the two charged particle, fusion occurs, but then the products may touch the container. And so the whole challenge is to confine the plasma in the central line of the tokamak. And for this, there is a big experiment being planned, going on already at International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, ITER. In fact, one of the participants is from IPR, who may be participating in this experiment. I just give you a glimpse of this ITER experiment. So ITER stands for International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. In fact, it is considered as the world's largest experimental tokamak fusion reactor. It is being built at south of Paris, south of France, Cadarache, city of Cadarache in France. And it is an international project funded by European Union, 45%. India also contributing to the tune of 10%. And also China, Russia, Japan, South Korea. In fact, I think this number is 9% each, India, China, but later on I saw India's share is 10%, but it could be 9% each. Now, this is a big project. In fact, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars experiments money is being contributed by all different countries of the world. And the construction of this facility began in 2007. The targets, the milestones for this are that the first plasma is expected to be produced by 2025, and the reactor operation will start. The deuterium-tritium fusion operation will take place from milestone 2035. So the objective of this particular fusion reactor is to produce 500 megawatt of fusion power sustained up to 1000 seconds. So now you see this, there is something called the Q, the gain of the fusion reactor. The gain has to be, let us say, actually, if gain is 1, that means input power and output power are same. But if you have a gain of 5, that means if you have 100 megawatt power as input energy, then you get 500 megawatt of output energy. And if you have a gain of 10, then for 100 megawatt input energy, you get 1000 megawatt of output energy. So that is the real challenge, to how to maximize the output energy of the fusion reactor, and for how much time you can sustain this fusion reaction. This is the challenge. India has been, in fact, you must have read in the news few months back that India successfully completed the cryostat, which is required for this fusion reactor. The contribution from India will be in terms of the cryogenics, the cryostat, very big cryostat, I think 10 to 20 meters dimension. Also the heating systems, the power supply, and many other systems, the logistics. So many components India is manufacturing. Many, the IPR I think is contributing, and many universities are also participating in this. In fact, Larsen and Toubro is the heavy engineering giant manufacturing these big systems. So we have a lot of scope for challenging research in future, and I'm sure some of you may like to participate in this endeavor and join. If you are doing PhD, maybe you can join as a postdoc in this ITER experiments. There are a lot of vacancies coming up every year. I see vacancies for ITER. So many of you may like to join this challenging research, and in your lifetime, you will be able to see energy being harnessed from fusion. I may not be able to see energy from fusion being harnessed for electricity, but I am sure you will be able to see how fusion can give energy, like electricity, using the fusion. Also, there are now other offshoots of this. There is called as tritium breeding materials. So, see where from you get this tritium. So there are now a lot of research going on making these materials which will be put in this ITER reactor like a blanket material. When the neutron will bombard, let us say lithium, then you can breed tritium. So there will be a blanket material in the form of lithium compound, lithium aluminate or lithium titanate, and the neutron generated by DT fusion will induce reaction in lithium, and you will have, so you have to sustain this reaction. So if you want to generate tritium, and probably in situ, that tritium can be then used for continuing this fusion reactor. So lot of information is available about ITER in the internet also, and many of the universities in India are participating in these experiments. So some of you may be knowing more than what I have discussed here. But since there was a discussion yesterday that you wanted Madam Uma Shankari to explain that, I thought I'll share with you whatever information I have with me. So that's all I had with me today, and thank you for your attention.